Welcome back to Jane's Italia. People often talk about the power of aircraft, but something that's talked about much less is their sensor capabilities. So today I want to talk about this with the analyst Leonardo Lanzara. Welcome back, Leo.
Hello, all. Thanks, Janu, for inviting me.
So, Leo, there's a lot of talk these days. We've also seen it in the Middle East. How important it is to be able to understand what's around you or what's coming your way in some way against the threats, the dangers that are in a certain area. So I would start from that point to talk about what we want to talk about today about the main aircraft. The floor is yours. Yes.
Tonight, we're talking about AWACS, that is, aircraft, usually called radar planes, which are among the most important assets of a modern air force, especially if it's an air force that projects power. So, typically, a Western air force, specifically the American one. We are in the middle of the so-called Third Gulf War between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other. And these radar aircraft are definitely among the most important. They're never talked about because we talk about F-35s, missiles, ballistic missiles, but these aircraft are actually the backbone, so one of the most important parts of any military operation. Along with other rarely mentioned assets like aerial refuelers, for example. We've seen that some have been lost in one or two flight incidents, some destroyed on the ground. Just like electronic warfare or spy aircraft, they're almost never taken into consideration, but they're force multipliers. AWACS is an acronym if you want to put it in the presentation so we can show it then. AWACS or AEWC, Airborne Early Warning and Control. By now, AWACS has become more common in jargon, also because it's easier to say AWACS than to say AEWC, so it's also a bit more colloquial. They're not just flying radars, they're actually control nodes for the airspace. And it's a prerogative of the Western Air Force to have these aircraft that not only see far, but also coordinate movements and assign targets for our air forces. They also handle deconfliction, meaning they try to prevent friendly fire and things like that. So they are absolutely important assets. Historically speaking, the Gulf War of '91, which many of us remember personally because we might have even seen it on television. We remember the AWACS, that is, aircraft made like this one. Here, this is an E-3 Sentry, which has become the AWACS par excellence. Even though it's a very old aircraft, quite a few have been retired in the last 2 or 3 years, precisely because they're very old. It's an aircraft. You see that white, black, round thing on the top? It's called a radome, actually a rotodome, because it rotates.
I used to say radome too, actually, but I recently found out that there's a small difference.
Yes, and by the way, this rotating part is slowly being phased out. In more modern vehicles, they are starting to have ICE antennas, which don't need mechanical rotation but direct the beam electronically. This allows you to avoid this rotating device, but even in a fighter jet, for example, in modern fifth generation fighters, even 4.5 generation. Mechanically scanned radars have all been replaced or are being replaced with ESA radars, simply because you avoid a mechanism that can break, needs maintenance, and so on. Instead, having flat faces, a flat-faced radar allows you to direct the radar beam, and therefore to scan faster and avoid a lot of maintenance problems. Even more,
You're the technician, so tell me too, because maybe when I studied this, maybe I understood it wrong. Basically, there are aircraft like the one you just showed, the E3, that direct the antenna to a specific position, but it leaves an area uncovered for a certain fraction of a second. Instead, ASA radars are made up of very small antennas that can continuously steer the beam so they don't need to be physically pointed. It's like instead of moving your neck, you had a head that could see everything while staying still.
Or you move your eyes actually, but you don't really move them. It's as if we could. Actually, what comes to my mind more is the spider. As a comparison, spiders have 6 or 8 eyes. Why? Because they need to cover, they have their eyes mounted on their body. They don't have their eyes mounted on a head. They have their eyes mounted on their body. And thanks to these eyes all around, they can look everywhere without having to move. So it makes me think more of a spider. I hate spiders.
By the way, that's also a great comparison. Here, I have to say,
But having small children, then you end up getting creative. Well, anyway, it's a system that works because it also allows you to keep multiple targets under control. So it's a very different area, and you can do electronic warfare. You can do many things with electronically scanned radars. Let's go back to the AWACS. If this is perhaps the most iconic image, well, this is also an iconic image. A nice shot from 91. This is Desert Storm. This was the position that the E3S took around Iraq. Basically, you can see that with 4 planes, you could keep the Iraqi airspace under control. At the time, these aircraft were able to see the Iraqi planes as soon as they took off from their bases, precisely because they were able to cover the whole area without interference, since they stayed far from the front line. The AWACS stays at a distance because it can see hundreds of kilometers away. It depends on what you're looking for. Spotting a large aircraft is different from spotting a low-flying fighter. So take all the figures you see with a grain of salt, because it depends on 1,000 variables. This applies to missiles, to radars, to everything. Okay, so what's the point? To see farther and manage air traffic better, manage targets better, keep an area under control. It means you're faster at handling everything that happens on the battlefield. The famous OODA loop by John Boyd, observe, orient, decide, act. I wanted to add a touch of philosophy to this as well. Basically, this cycle of observation, orientation, decision, and action keeps repeating even in our own lives. And the faster you do it, the better you do it, the better you are able to operate. The more you can throw sand into the gears of the enemy, who also has the same loop, the more advantages you will gain. This OODA loop still exists today. It's applied. It's been around for 50 years, but it's still applied today, for example, to multi-domain warfare. So it's a philosophical concept, but also a very practical one. And if you think about it, all of us in our lives observe something, we orient ourselves based on our culture, our training, our experience, our way of being. We decide and we act. This also happens in everyday life. Okay, so being able to look ahead means being able to manage and plan better. But this aircraft I showed you earlier, the E3 Sentry, is a civilian aircraft, basically, and that's normal. In the West, almost everywhere in the world, with some exceptions, in China, in Russia, the first ones that come to mind, they take civilian aircraft and modify them, because at the end of the day, an AWACS has a flight profile that is very similar to that of a civilian aircraft. They stay away from combat zones, they stay in circuits for hours and hours and hours. And so the most economical thing you can do is take a civilian plane and modify it. It's cheap to build because it already exists. Maintenance is simplified because many parts are shared with the civilian aircraft, so it's a very smart solution. In Russia and China, they begin with transport aircraft for other reasons. Also because in the West, we have a very good civil industry that produces hundreds of aircraft, so it makes a lot of sense to use this type of aircraft for AWACS, as well as for aerial refueling. It's not strange.
you can also, for example, take out the passenger seats and have a workspace for the operator stations for the crew working inside the aircraft. So it absolutely makes sense from this point of view for a fairly reasonable cost, because we see it ourselves with the Gulfstream. If I'm not mistaken,
Yes, here in Europe, we have smaller sizes, while the typical American aircraft is a large Boeing. Here in Europe, we do it with slightly smaller aircraft, but on the other hand, we also have slightly different needs. Let's also keep in mind that thanks to AWACS and ISR aircraft, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, Ukraine, for example, has always had an informational advantage since day one of the war. These are aircraft that often we forget about, the AWACS, but they are absolutely important. That said, however, in our modern world, they are also exposed to a series of risks because there is a new threat to take into consideration. I show you this in a very realistic way, talking about the Pacific, since it seems that the next stage of global hegemonic competition will be the Pacific, so between the United States and China. In this context, we have vast distances and we have an adversary, namely China, compared to the United States, which in the last 20 years has grown a lot from a technological point of view and has been able to make not only good fighter jets, but also missiles. Air-to-air missiles with medium, long, and very long range, which can be a threat, especially for the AWACS. What do I mean? The AWACS can't be stealth. Besides being large, it emits a huge amount of electromagnetic power because it has a very powerful radar. It's like a lighthouse in the middle of the sea, you see? So and it's also a very important asset. So on the other hand, the first thing they do is counter them, try to take them down, because taking down a tanker or an AWACS means crippling the entire operational part of a military operation. And so if we can, I'll show you. For example, this aircraft here, which is a Chinese aircraft called the J-20, is armed with four. You see the ventral bay with four PL-15 missiles that have a range of 200 kilometers, maybe even a bit more, but still it might not be enough to hit an AWACS that's even farther away. So they came up with even more powerful missiles. Okay, this is a J-10 also with this array of air-to-air missiles, and they came up with this one. So for a few years now, people have been talking about the PL-17, which is a large missile around 6 meters long, huge, that's supposed to be used for sniping, air-to-air. So this big missile is probably almost certainly designed to hit large, high-value targets at a great distance. The missile won't be very maneuverable, but we need to hit the AWACS you saw earlier. It could also do the job in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We are seeing a very high number of air-to-air engagements using long-range missiles that aren't particularly agile, but they can cause a lot of damage and can still force you to abort the mission. Russia compared to Ukraine. We're talking about a missile that will have at least a 300-kilometer range, some say even 500. So it's a real danger, of course. How do you guide a missile like that at those distances? The missile definitely has a data link so that it can head toward its target passively based on data coming from other AWACS, for example, or from third-party sources in general. After that, in the immediate vicinity, it activates its radar guidance. And here it is, here we have it. This is a very recent photo taken at a fair in China. Nice, big. Who will carry it? Surely, given its size, it's a missile to be carried externally. So in fact, we see something at the top. Will this be a J-15 and a J-11? But that's exactly the idea. So the AWACS are starting to become less and less secure in their operations. Then someone might ask me, how effective are Chinese missiles? Well, we don't know. However, in the clash between India and Pakistan in 2025, a brief conflict lasting a few days, some Chinese fighter jets in the hands of Pakistan, the J-10S armed with PL-15S performed quite well, though maybe not as well as the Pakistanis wanted to make us believe. They probably exaggerated a bit. But the fact remains that they might have hit something. They performed better than many people expected.
Forgive me, wasn't there also the matter of an AWACS, if I'm not mistaken, from Saab, which still provided targeting for the missile once it was launched?
Well done, well done. In fact, Pakistan has, if I remember correctly, two Saab aircraft that do exactly this job. They're AWACS. We also have a photo. Let me find it now. Let's see. Here it is, pulling it up now. In the meantime, we have here this one.
Which, by the way, has been talked about recently in these days, because I think a new one will be provided for Ukraine, which is already offering some.
This is one of the best European solutions we have. In the case of Pakistan, it's absolutely possible that the radar, which is that rectangle you see on top, doesn't rotate. No, but it's one of the faces of the electronically scanned radar. From here, most likely came the data that was sent to the air-to-air missile. After that, when you get to an appropriate distance from the target, the missile activates its own radar and proceeds to autonomous engagement. But in the meantime, it remains passive. And this is a problem because it's hard to detect. If a radar seeker head activates in the last seconds of the engagement, it means that the target pilot has only a few seconds to defend against this engagement. And that's exactly the point of having air-to-air missiles with a bidirectional link, which today are within everyone's reach. It makes much more sense compared to the first versions. Let's think about the Phoenix, the AIM-54s from the 1970s, which would head in the presumed direction of the target based on detection, and then the very first versions. Then they would activate the radar. Everything was much less precise. Okay.
So what would be interesting, it would be interesting, sorry to interrupt you, to know in the coming weeks if any news comes out about what hit that F-35 in Iran, which missile, because we actually have a lot of questions about it, because for now we can't know. For all we know, it could have even been an Iranian kamikaze pigeon. There's also that famous video circulating, which seems suspicious to me. I have to be honest, because I find it pretty strange that they only show 10 seconds of video. And above all, let's remember that Iran is making heavy use of artificial intelligence technologies to alter images to its own advantage. No, especially when there's news that has some truth to it. So we'll see in the future. Surely on Mirko's channel, you'll talk about that incident on Parabellum involving the F-35 that was hit, not shot down. And it's interesting because it brings us back to the discussion about how the missile seeker reaches the target and the defenses that can be used or put in place.
Yes, an unverified video. We're at the end of March 2026. There's no certainty about the video. There's no certainty about many things. But it's not like fifth generation fighters are invulnerable. So in a certain sense, this episode, which is not confirmed, I repeat, and I don't know the truth, I don't know it, serves as a reminder that there isn't a solution for every problem. The F-35s, the fifth generation fighters, are harder to shoot down, but they are not invulnerable.
They are low observable, not invisible, as you taught me.
Exactly, low observable, not invisible. They are very visible, especially if you put them up there on a clear, bright day at 2 in the afternoon.
All right, excuse me.
I didn't mean to go that far.
But since we were just talking about it,
let's get back to our AWACS. So as I was saying, the E3 is old. It's very old. So they're thinking about replacing it. Clearly, there was this whole illusion from 20 years of the war on terrorism, fighting bearded men, low-intensity wars, which made us forget that these aircraft were already old in the early 2000s. Then the Russia-Ukraine war happened, we saw what happened, and suddenly we woke up from the dream that the world was a peaceful place. And so suddenly there's a rush to replace these aircraft that have an operational availability rate of around 60%, which is very low. Because they're old, it's starting to get hard to find spare parts. It's basically the same situation as with the B-1 or the A-10, because these are iconic, very famous aircraft. But after 40 years or more of service, they're starting to have an industrial problem that needs to be managed. We're still talking about a high-performance aircraft, the E3, because it can detect aircraft at medium to high altitude, around 650 kilometers away. But it needs an upgrade, It needs a more modern radar. It needs a new airframe that's easier to maintain after decades of service. So what are the possible solutions? Here's one. We've seen this on American aircraft carriers. It's the Hawkeye E2, which is also used by the French.
But China as well, I think, has made a very similar version.
They created an identical version called the KJ500. I'll get to that in a moment. Let me go through the Russians for a second. This is the A-50. Several of these have been destroyed in the Russia-Ukraine war, but let's remember that Russia only has a few of them. That's because their air force isn't like the American one, doctrinally speaking. It's a more defensive air force, if I can put it that way, definitely not focused on power projection. They have few aerial refuelers and few AWACS because that's their doctrine. This is the A-50 I can show you later. So we've seen the S-100B, which is again derived from a civilian aircraft, the Saab 350. Instead, the A-50 is derived from the good old Il-76, which is not.
For a few months in North Korea, the A-50 can be.
North Korea is receiving a bit of everything. Thanks to its excellent cooperation with Russia, it's receiving know-how e material. Then it's not like we know a lot, but they surely didn't do it for free. To send men and equipment and artillery pieces, more than 1 million pieces of artillery to Russia. Yes.
Yes, there was a lot of talk. You're reminding me of old conversations before we continue. Leo, just one thing, I was rude. By the way, we talked a lot about the Pacific. Let me remind you that you'll find Leo's book, The Pacific Challenge, in the first comment because we keep talking about the Pacific in this episode. Let me remind you to go and support Leo's work and also the channel by purchasing the book. Sorry for the plug, but I thought it was the right thing to do since we're here talking about big ideas.
No, but thank you. Also, talking about the Pacific, as we do in this book, really means talking a bit about everything. This is the only book currently available in bookstores that talks about the Pacific scenario in all its aspects. Instead of buying 5 different books, each covering a different aspect of this great theater, here you have everything all at once. So, if you want to do us a favor, thank you. Now, back to our AWACS. This is ours. It's Italian. The G550 CAEW is also derived from a Gulfstream 550, and it's also well regarded. Then there are the helicopters. This one, for example, is...
Nice. I hadn't seen this one in the presentation, actually.
Well, I surprised you. You can see how the radar is mounted under the nose of the helicopter. Then, of course, this is an EH-101 CAEW, so it's a specific version. Helicopters are a good solution for radar coverage, but of course they have all the limitations of a helicopter. But it's better than nothing. China has this, which is a KJ500, which is a decent achievement. And then there's this, the latest one, much more capable, the KJ3000. And this is based, again, on a Y-20 cargo aircraft. I never know what I should call it. Y-20, Y-20, Y-20. You see, you get what I mean. And this is the one Gianluca likes, which is the unauthorized copy of the E2 Hawkeye. It's actually very similar to the Hawkeye, which is also in service in France, for example, on French aircraft carriers. I think it's the only American aircraft anyway that's been licensed.
You're getting at the point that when something works, in the end, a wheel is a wheel. You can modify it, you can add grooves, whatever you want. But if a design works, we also see it very often with the Chinese version of the F-35. In the end, the solutions are often very similar. Then the core is different, obviously.
Yes, also because the Chinese put in their own engines, their own radar. We have to stop thinking about China as it was 20 years ago. In the fields of radar, drones, missiles, hypersonics, and I believe also AI. If they're not on par, they're very close. And in some sectors like hypersonics and missiles, hypersonics, they have a frightening arsenal, so they're actually ahead. It takes time. Respect for the Chinese industry, but also 20 years ago, what were the Chinese producing? Think about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, today, and 5 or 10 years from now. So be careful. You need a lot of respect and you shouldn't look down on them. Shahed Dolce Bravo.
Bravo. And then we're right on the flight deck, I think, of an aircraft carrier. Let's remember that the Fujian should be here. I don't know if this is the Fujian because I can't see it. Obviously, Fujian.
Definitely yes. Yes, because to launch this aircraft, you need the catapult and you need the catobar.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to get to. Let's remember, in fact, that we went from not being able to have our own aircraft carrier to building one from scratch with the Empire system. What's it called?
EMOS is actually a commercial name for electromagnetic catapults.
And let's remember, in fact, that they succeed, whereas the Americans, for some rather particular reasons on the Ford, are not able to do it. That is to launch an F-35 stealth aircraft from an aircraft carrier. And in their case, obviously, the counterpart, they achieved this milestone before the Americans. All right.
Exactly. Anyway, you need respect. Absolutely be careful not to look down on them. And let's move on. To the one that gave us, to the aircraft that gave us the idea for today's meeting, that is the E7 Wedgetail. Little known, it's a new AWACS of a new design, even though it's not that new, because Australia was the first to adopt it about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and Great Britain, Turkey, and South Korea have it, while the USAF, the US Air Force, the American Air Force had selected it a few years ago with the idea of bringing it into service quickly. For the reason mentioned earlier, because the E-3 Sentry aircraft are getting old, they were in a hurry. Here it is, as you can see, always on a commercial platform, on a Boeing, that's what you're seeing. On the back of the aircraft, let's use a more appropriate term, on the upper part of the fuselage, otherwise they'll criticize us. That's the radar again.
On the top of the fuselage, I feel like saying yes.
It's true.
So,
Modern aircraft, very modern radar that already exists. It's not a prototype because it's called Wedgetail. Greetings to Baba Skura, because it takes its name from the wedge-tail eagle, a large bird of prey that's typically Australian, which therefore gives the project a bit of Australian parentage, because the Wedgetail E7 was created for Australia and they named it after the bird of prey that's a symbol of Australia. And I didn't know that because I had stopped at the terrifying spiders, the crocodiles, the worst beasts in the world. But I discovered the wedgetail thanks to aviation. You see, aviation, where I take you, is a magical land.
Australia, where even a little bunny could hurt you, we also have these nice birds of prey. We try.
If you survive, all the beasts are doing well. Why is the E7 interesting? Well, first of all, you see, it's an interesting project. Technically, not a lot is known about it because there are some details, but just enough. The Americans' idea was to have the first operational model in 2027 and to have 26 wedgetails by 2032. In the meantime, the old E3s are phased out, personnel are trained, making the transition from the old to the new, and that's how this modernization process moves forward. NATO, in the same way, since the Americans support the project, also thought about following this process. As you can see, I'm speaking in past conditionals because in 2025, the American administration decides, so Trump in his second term decides to cancel the wedgetail. So everything was already in place, production had started, prototypes were in line, and there was already a fairly organized plan to introduce the aircraft. They decide to cancel the project. The Americans are no strangers to these cancellations. There's the Constellation class, there was confusion.
Sorry, after this comes a frigate.
Only 3 people got it, the naval enthusiast. So the class,
Then there's the M10 Booker.
here the Booker, good, the Constellation class, and the helicopter, the Farah, also launched and then canceled. So they reviewed everything, only to then talk about the return of battleships. Trump class, yes.
Let's wait a few years before talking about the Trump class. Yes.
But we've also heard about the twin-engine F-35. What does it take to make a twin-engine F-35? I say, let's put in two. Why not three? Why not four?
These are magical moments from an engineering point of view.
Well, anyway, the idea was to get rid of the E-7 Wedgetail and focus everything on satellites and other AWACS like the E-2 Hawkeye. It's already there, it's smaller, it's more modern, so why not? Well, this way I reduce costs, invest more in space sensors, and so on. Nice. Too bad the E-2 Hawkeye are smaller on aircraft carriers. Or do we want to compare it with the radar range, with the endurance of an E-3? It seems almost trivial to say it. They also have fewer crew members on board. The fewer crew you have, the fewer contacts and radars you can manage, the fewer missions you can handle. Satellites are also slower. Nice idea, too bad the technology still isn't that reliable or effective. For aerial targets, the satellite is fine for ground reconnaissance, but not yet for aerial targets. There's still some work to do. Satellites are vulnerable too, because there have been anti-satellite weapons since the 1970s. Or do we also have anti-satellite weapons? And at that point, even NATO backs off, because given the US hesitations, NATO stops as well. NATO too, with the Wedgetail. And in addition, tying ourselves closely to the United States. Well, Trump doesn't really have much love for us parasites, European countries. It makes you wonder if tying ourselves to an American project may not be a good idea. Everything is at a standstill. But that's not the end, because at the end of 2025, Congress talks to about 15 former generals and experts and brings the 7 Wedgetails back to life. So it comes back to life. The B-1 was revived a few times, and now we're reviving the E-7 too. Even though it hasn't even been built yet, we're already bringing it back. Well, however, in the meantime, years have passed, and the E-3S, which were already struggling because they're old, keep having even more trouble than before. The price of the Wedgetail has gone up because everything in the world is getting more expensive, except for salaries, and the price of the aircraft keeps rising. And the European members of the alliance are thinking about Saab, about the Riai, for example. And it's understandable, given that there's this disconnect between the United States and Europe within NATO, a NATO whose future is uncertain. The Europeans have started to think differently. Precious time has been lost, while China has moved forward. Global geopolitics has gone into crisis, and we are in the middle of a war in the Middle East. It's a good thing Trump was supposed to retreat into the Monroe Doctrine and his own hemisphere, because otherwise, who knows what would have happened. By now, it's the doctrine of horror. Period. So we are in a severely deteriorated international situation. Wasting time is not a good idea, but this is the situation. This was the aircraft as it was envisioned. Fortunately, the production lines are still active, and it seems that the first prototypes will soon be coming online. Some time has been lost.
It should be a concept, let's say.
It should be a concept, if I remember correctly, yes.
Or simply an Australian plane with some computer modifications to make it.
Anyway, this is the aircraft, yes, the radar. What do we expect from the radar? Still here, on the upper part of the fuselage, we expect 360-degree coverage, 180 targets, and 24 simultaneous interceptions, a range of 600 kilometers under the best possible conditions, which drops to half. A little more for aircraft the size of a fighter, because of course a fighter is one thing, detecting something larger is another, and a stealth fighter is something else again. Still, naval targets. Here we're even talking about naval targets because the radar will still have interception capability over the sea. These are figures that should naturally be taken with a grain of salt, but they give you an idea of what this radar is capable of.
The Shahed 136.
In your opinion, much less difficulty, and I choose it. It's hard to spot because it's small, it flies low, it's made of non-metallic materials, so it's hard to detect, and it's also slow, it's not easy. Aircraft, drones like the Shahed are effective. Fighter jets, which is one thing to do. Fighter jets with fighter jets, you can hunt something with a fighter jet. hunting. Stealth is something you can do with a fighter jet.
Basse quote, basse velocità.
Yes, a fighter jet is something that can hunt. It's very difficult. You need different tools, but it can definitely spot a Shahed. Definitely, yes. I can't tell you the distance also because if I knew.
Then it also depends on the scenario. I imagine that a Shahed flying at 100 meters altitude in a mountainous area, which can interfere with radio waves, is one thing from the point of view, maybe, of a version. Shahed 136, like the one China is developing, because in the end, everyone is copying the Shahed 136, the Russians with the Garen, the United States with the Lucas. And a few days ago, there was news about a sort of Shahed 136, but in a Chinese version. Also, because, as we said before, once the wheel works, you copy it. And so we might see something similar in a possible crisis in the Pacific. I imagine the United States is also looking at that kind of scenario.
Absolutely, absolutely. By the way, Lucas, which is the American drone, is cloned, but they openly say it's American. Yes,
Yes, they actually said it. They said it. We copied it.
they copied it and improved it. Exactly.
Also, because the same thing happened with Iran with some drones, just the other way around. If I'm not mistaken, it might be similar to the Predator. One crashed. But in the end, those are the solutions. We always come back to that point.
But after all, the Predator. Reaper gave rise to a series of copies by the Iranians, by the Chinese. There's the Russian Geran-2. It's the improved copy of the Shahed. It's thought-provoking that Iran had this idea and no one had it before them. Also because here we are, always. At the end of March 2026, they're still launching quite a few drones. They keep going. So yes, it's a good idea.
They're easy to produce. You have plenty available, both in storage and, as I said, they're easy to build. And then it depends on what you want, because we were just talking about this a few days ago. We were racking our brains about how they hit the target, and then we came up with a very simple answer. Also, with Andrea Gaspardo and Arturo Giusti, the most obvious answer is that some Shahed 136 are the Ferrari version. No, some have infrared, some have GPS, while others are much more basic and also have different costs. No, because as you said, you mentioned the Garen. The Garen was developed starting from the Shahed 136. Now we have some versions, even with a propulsion system, which makes it even harder to intercept. As for the final phases or along its flight path using artillery, which can simply be made up of cannons, high, of course.
That's fine. Bene. Good. All right. What else? As for the Wedgetail, more or less the information that makes sense to give is this. Here I took a sheet from, oh God, from Boeing, yes, which gives you a bit of a summary. It's a marketing brochure. So I'll tell you a little bit about what makes up this aircraft, which is derived, first of all, from a 737-700, and it tells you pretty much everything, the fundamental things. You can see there are 10 control consoles. I'll show them to you. Here they are. This is Turkish. It's a Turkish E7, and it gives you an idea of what it's like. The inside of the aircraft, basically, it's the same civilian aircraft that you took to go on a trip somewhere, but furnished differently and with consoles that usually block the windows, normally the window.
So this is different from usual.
Yes, very, very much. And you spend many hours in there. So even in this case, the logistical advantage is that the 737-700 is a new aircraft built in many, many variants, including the P-8 Poseidon. For maritime patrol, again, commonality of spare parts, pilot training, logistics, all of this helps. And in the end, for the rest, the E7 will do what the old E3 Sentry does, what all the other AWACS do, but with advantages from better technology and radar, and a more modern airframe. So that's the job the E7 will have to do. So to wrap up, what can we say? That it's necessary to have more modern AWACS, not only because they're needed in the current strategic situation, because they have to replace old aircraft, but also because China, in the meantime, has made great progress, so we can't afford to fall behind China in technological innovation. This, from the American perspective, is precisely because of the perceived upcoming confrontation around the Pacific. Should it have been done earlier? Yes, it should have been done earlier, maybe even at the end of the 90s or the early 2000s, but it wasn't done because we didn't feel the need for it. And now we have to hurry. But the United States, and then I'll really finish, had a little problem. They ended up with a series of programs piling up, not just aeronautical ones, all during this period, all urgent. From the replacement of the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles with the Sentinel, with a monstrous increase in costs, extremely long timelines, a disaster. The B-21 Raider, the F-47 anyway, the sixth generation fighter, which suddenly became urgent, so urgent that the F-22s need to be modernized because they have to serve as a bridge. The F-22s should have been modernized a long time ago, but there was no perceived need. Now there's fear. The new air-to-air missiles, the IM-260, because suddenly people realize that China can shoot farther than you. Then what did I forget?
The arrival of the same generation for the fleet as well, the facts.
You can't tell whether they're going ahead with it or not. Nothing makes sense. Too many programs have piled up there all around the same time, all urgent. So they had to manage it with a potential confrontation in mind.
Of course. Just also to mention Italy, even the trainer that might see the M346 in a US context, the Beechcraft, they formed a partnership, just to mention Italy too.
Sorry, of course, but what happened in Ukraine was a rude awakening, a bit for everyone. If we add to this the recent events in the Middle East and a China that's been increasingly assertive for a while now, so all these programs are necessary, but the budget is what it is and the resources are what they are. The same goes for military personnel in the United States. So I know the US case quite well. I talk about it often because I see it from the perspective of the Pacific and also from the perspective of the technological challenge. Well, here in the West, we've relaxed a bit for a bit too long, unfortunately, because we would have liked everyone to be relaxed and not have to deal with the crises that we now see continuously. For months now, unfortunately, this has been the situation, and now we have to hurry. Also for AWACS, and good luck to the United States who have wasted time. It would be good if Europe, perhaps, and with this I'll really finish, developed its own AWACS program. It's right to look at Saab's jets, but I don't see why we shouldn't also consider something perhaps even more high-performing. We have Airbus making aircraft day in and day out. I don't want to mention the A400M, which is for transport, but with all the aircraft that Airbus makes. Is it possible that we can't make our own European-style E7 Wedgetail? Maybe, there you go, perfect.
And losing on the Eurodrone, there you go. Maybe it would be useful to go back and reassess those programs and turn them into something different, right? Another thing that came to mind while you were talking is maybe finding a low-cost unmanned solution that can patrol the area for a longer time using, in fact, unmanned vehicles. Something that maybe we could see soon with the development of the GCAP, which will need loyal wingman drones. And who knows, maybe we could even slip in a few drones to do ISR. AWACS, as you say.
Well done. You've introduced an interesting topic. Because what is the AWACS of the future? Why should we assume that the AWACS of the future has to be this big aircraft with a big radar? Since there are increasingly autonomous drones, UCAVs, which are unmanned combat aerial vehicles, it's not certain that we can delegate various ISR, radar, and reconnaissance functions, even stealth ones. On board these aircraft, these drones, excuse me, but after all, a drone is an aircraft on board these drones, because you know that you can configure a combat drone pretty much however you want, right? You can tell it to do reconnaissance, to attack ground targets, to do air-to-air, to provide protection. So I wouldn't rule out at all that the future AWACS system could be a combination of a large piloted aircraft like an E7 type but that there is a whole constellation of sensors distributed on drones, on UCAVs, all around it. And these can also be stealth because we could activate the radar and make ourselves visible since we're active when needed. But when we want to be passive, we have a stealth platform. Like the Anka 3, the Turkish one, for example, with these triangular shapes, which can bring reconnaissance closer to the combat theater. Because an aircraft like the E-7, these large AWACS can't get too close, they're too visible, too vulnerable. You keep them in the back to manage to act as a command node for other UCAVs. Why not? And you keep these UCAVs closer to the combat zone. Why not? It could be the idea of the future, a manned-unmanned teaming, the famous MUMT, which can be applied to combat aircraft in GCAP, which you know very well, Gianlu, because you talk about it often. What is the GCAP? What is it? The sixth generation fighter? It's a system of systems, a piloted aircraft, the Tempest in our case for GCAP, with an ecosystem of drones around it that do, well, take your pick. You just need to configure them.
Yes, by the way, now we'll really wrap up. I didn't mean to take up an hour of your time, but it's always fun talking to you. I know there are studies, well, some of them are still very experimental, aiming to transfer energy from the ground to an aircraft. But this is a very experimental kind of technology. And then there are studies about aircraft that can theoretically stay in flight for a very, very long time. We're even talking about weeks, thanks to solar energy and stored solar power. So you fly very high, collect the energy, stay in one area, and when needed, return to the area where you have to operate. It's a bit like what we'll probably see with the famous UUVs with underwater drones, like the Manta Ray, for example, which you position in an area. It deploys a storage system through the waves, through the motion of the sea, and it can stay there for months, for years, and when you need it, you reactivate it. So these systems exist, the drones. What really surprised me about the Middle East was how many people seem surprised, sorry for the repetition, that drones exist. I mean, it really seems like after years of Nagorno-Karabakh, the war in Ukraine, people are acting like they've just discovered this. Well, that's another story. I hope they make amends once and for all. So, Leo, I thank you. I obviously invite you to go and buy, if you haven't already, La Sfida del Pacifico. You'll find the link directly in the first comment. And I know that tonight there's a live stream from Mirko from Parabellum, so good luck with your work. And thanks for stopping by.
Thank you all for being with us. See you soon.
See you soon here on Gens Italia. Bye.